We're live. John, good morning. Thanks for joining.
Morning. Good to see you again.
Everybody, as you know by now, hopefully my name is Robbie Martin. I work for Sonatype, which is an open source application security company. And I'm joined this morning by, I didn't tell him I was going to say this, but I do owe John Scott from Ion Channel a debt of gratitude. When I first made the pivot from fintech and HR sales into the technology and open source space, I was looking back through the virtual Rolodex of LinkedIn. I was like, I got to find some mentors in this space. And John was gracious enough to blindly accept that. And we've had a lot of good conversations since then. And I've really appreciated that, man. So I wanted to thank you publicly for that. But John, I'll kick it over to you. If you want to give a little background and intro, John is the Director of Federal and National Security at Ion Channel. So also in the open source security space. We met 5 years ago, actually, when I was working at ADP. I set up their payroll, HR, their 401k, and we've reconnected since then. So John, tell everybody a little about yourself and we'll get started.
Yeah, so it's a great to see you again, Robbie. Yeah, we were 5 years ago. You were helped get us into ADP, and that was great. So Ion Channel. So I'm a co-founder and president and COO of Ion Channel, as well as a head of federal. So we're focused around the software supply chain. So the issues we run into, we've been working on over the last 6 years, coming out of the U.S. intelligence community, have all been around how do people know what they're working on and what they're using from a software supply chain perspective. Typically, what we see is it's not really a software problem. It's not really an open source software problem. It's basically an asset management problem for a lot of people. But that's kind of what we're working on.
Sure, I appreciate that framework, and I've kind of contextualized it for myself as I've gotten deeper into the space, where there seems to be a little bit of a lack of clarity and visibility. And if you want to give everybody a little bit of a brief history around what open source is, where it came from, and why the security of it is important, if people that are watching think of it as a physical sense or a production line, if you look at manufacturing today, if you hear about a recall in a car, the airbag manufacturer immediately gets pointed out. The manufacturer of the brakes immediately gets pointed out. So there's much more visibility into where these components came from and what makes them up. Sometimes that's a little bit lacking from the software space. So it might be helpful if we started with what is open source? What are the security challenges? And we'll start there.
Yeah, so open source, it was coined originally as free and open source software about 30 years ago I've forgotten at this point. But the idea is that people would create software, developers would create software, and then would release it as a public good under a number of different trademarks and licenses, open source software licenses. Open source is governed by copyright law, just interestingly enough. But these are put out there as public works for folks to use on their own, hopefully contribute back to their different licenses that have different rules. But really, it's a way of trying to create a larger public good, because if you've built a piece of network timing software, oftentimes that problem is going to be needed by a lot of other stuff. And so typically with open source, what you see is there's lots of projects that maybe couldn't actually you could build a company around, but there are pieces and features and things that lots more people would like to use and contribute and basically make things better. Now, there's also a lot of other projects people have built companies around that are open source. The other interesting thing about open source is software is made up of other software, so it is turtles all the way down, and so you have these dependency trees that just get bigger and bigger the larger projects get. You can end up with thousands of pieces of software, and that seems to be where a lot of the security issues are coming to, is people just not really understanding and realizing what's being brought into an organization or into a software build or a download.
So you'd mentioned these dependency trees, where are the security gaps? I mean, you've heard things in the last 6 months, Log4j, Spring Shell, going back to Equifax and SolarWinds, and the Struts kind of fiascos that made up some of these other breaches a few years ago. How do these breaches happen? Where does the security gaps come into play when you're talking about these dependency trees?
So I think what we're seeing in discussions and work and pilots and customers is that oftentimes it comes down to people just don't know what they don't know that they have. So you have this problem of, you can see the tree, but you can't really see the roots. You can't see the roots at the end of the tree. And so if you think of software, it's the same thing like that. And so you've got this one problem of you just don't know what you have in terms of what's inside of a piece of software. And then the second thing is you don't really understand the scale at which the modern organization is using software has just gotten so large and out of control Whereas back in maybe 20 years ago, you had one developer who really sort of understood everything that was in a package. But now you've got a medium-sized bank might have 20,000, 10,000 pieces of application software running just in their data centers. And so the scale at which the analysis that needs to occur and the understanding of the assets inside of the software builds has just gotten so large and out of control that it is really going away from this individual perspective of being able to understand what's inside of an individual piece of software. And so I think that you've got these sort of confluence of events of like, software builds getting bigger and bigger, lots of scale happening within organizations, and then lots of change in the supply chain on a continuous basis. And so, when things like Log4j come up, the first question becomes, do we have it? Where is it? And then lots of just sort of command line tools and clickety clackety going around to try and find what's going on. Which developers hate, and that sort of throws the entire organization off its cadence from a security perspective. To say nothing of things like vulnerabilities or just severely lagging indicators.
Sure.
So that's really the sort of the problems that we've been seeing.
Got it. Well, it's insightful that you said people don't know what they have. When they do discover a vulnerability, the first question is, do we have it at all? And then where is it in our environment? What's being done and what are organizations able to do to increase that visibility? You hear things about SBOMs or software bill of materials, but it almost sounds like lip service sometimes. So what actually are these things and what's the benefit of being able to produce them?
Yeah, so first off, you can't protect what you don't know you have. I mean, I think that's the first thing. I think obviously we have different ways of putting controls in place and compensating controls for security, and you need layered security like an onion and those sorts of things. But I think the first effort, you can't really predict what you don't know you have. And so if lots of stuff is coming into an organization, you need more transparency into just first, what's the top line of, like what's that car that came in the organization, but then what's the maintenance plan associated with that piece of software or that car? Things like software bills of material, it is not a means in of itself. It is basically the start of the analysis and the monitoring regime for that piece of software. And so I think that's where a lot of folks are kind of getting over their skis around just like, well, software bills of material is very, very important. It's like, no, it's actually just a piece of data that you need to analyze to understand what's going on in your software. And then doing that analysis on some sort of a continuous basis. So I think that's where the SBOMs are coming. The government's been pretty good about putting it out there as a thing because they're one of the largest consumers of software in the world, and so they're understanding that from especially closed source software, they need to have an understanding of what's inside that black box when it comes into an organization or that server or that binary or something.
When you say closed source, are you referring to proprietary code that was just written from the ground up and it's source code versus containing open source components?
Well, I don't know if there's any software anymore that's built that's proprietary. That's 100% just being built. Sorry.
John's a popular guy, everybody.
So I don't think there's any proprietary software that is 100% built without any open source software in it from the ground up. I mean, I think studies and surveys have shown that's just not possible. I mean, there might be some stuff, some smaller edge point devices and sensors, but so I think that there's always this concern. If you have things like a cancer pump or just various sensors that are out there in the power industry, like you'd like to know what's inside of that sensor, or what firmware is on that chip. To say nothing about the application software that's in the cloud. So I think that from a proprietary perspective, and that's what software bills of material will give you, because analyzing binaries is not really a thing that's very easily done, and those are bench tools. They don't operate at scale. So that's the first thing, is bill of materials gives you a view into that proprietary software, and then obviously you can have bills of material associated with open source software as well,
Sure.
which is great.
Got it. Well, to circle back a couple minutes, you'd mentioned that at least in the US, the Fed has done a good job of pushing the narrative and the need and visibility of SBOMs. But
Yep.
Where can the US government help, and where, if at all? I know there's some things going on with the OSS software security mobilization plan that just started a couple weeks ago, or was just released a couple weeks ago. I'm sure it's been being worked on for a long time. Where do you see the US government needing to pick up the baton, and where might private industry also need to pick up the challenge for security in the software space as well?
Yeah, so I think the government's done a good job of explaining why you need transparency into the software you're using. So I think that's been a great thing. I think that there's been less understandings around, all right, you've got either software bill of materials, you've got like a piece of open source software. I think there's less understanding about what do you do with it going forward. Obviously everybody wants to just key in on just software vulnerabilities. I mean, for a lot of reasons, software vulnerabilities it's like using one number for your cholesterol or for health, using one number for cholesterol that determines your entire health of your entire human
Doesn't
body.
tell the whole story.
Yeah, it doesn't tell the whole story. So I think that the next step is sort of understanding. I think that's where private industry can help, is like, well, what do you do with an SBOM kind of going forward? What does that start to give you? How do you get ahead of risks and managing what you're doing? I mean, that's obviously what we're doing. And so I think that's probably the next step as we get around, because everybody's kind of creating, lots of open source projects are popping up and little startups here and there that can create SBOMs, and that's great and all, but there's lots of issues that go beyond that, because if you just get an SBOM, you may as well just take it as a PDF and put it in your print out, put your desk drawer, there you go, you're done. But you've got to actually use the data to actually make it valuable, and sort of an early warning system, if you will.
So you see private industry being more helpful in what sounds like kind of the next step of remediation. Okay, now you know what you have, so we can protect against that a little bit more. But is there guidance available? Like, where do people get, okay, we've got our SBOM. Okay, what the hell do we do with this now? Is that where you see kind of private industry being able to help?
Yeah, I think that's where private industry will basically probably pick up the baton and basically run with it. I think it's funny. I mean, a lot of the things you should have been doing around your supply chain have been in federal guidance and best practice guidance for years and years and years. It was all just being done by individuals, not being done at scale by technology, because a lot of stuff is they're sort of hard and boring jobs. So I think you've got to start looking at how do you automate a lot of these tasks. I think that's where industry will come to the table with technology.
This is off the cuff, but it comes to a question I've been asking people. Is it seems like, and to preface to everybody, I haven't been in the open space for very long, so this is food for thought for me as well. It seems like it was a very volunteer and almost gracious type of software development from its roots. To your point, there may be some licensed trailers involved, but ultimately it was a public good. Take it, use it, give us feedback on it. And even till today, it seems like a lot of these packages and libraries are maintained by volunteers. So not necessarily private industry who may be building the tools like Sonatype and Ion Channel are. But for me, it seemed like there's a little bit of a shift, at least learning about this. I don't know where that shift totally happened, of it being a volunteer based
Yeah,
type of software.
I push back a little bit on the whole I think that has not been proven.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I start to talk to people, and if you go on the Slack list for various projects or things like OWASP, I mean, OWASP is a great organization, lots of volunteers there. But what you tend to find out is they're volunteers, but they're being paid by an organization to be part of that organization. So, it's like, all right, some folks I know, they work at a large tech company, an IT company, and then their part of their duties is to be part of the OWASP community to help those projects become better from a security perspective. And they're putting a bunch of stuff out there. And so, I think that this whole notion that it's this volunteer who's not compensated for their work, they're compensated, they're just volunteered by their organization. I mean, you just go through the open source ecosystem, you start looking at a lot of these people. Yes, a lot of people create stuff, but it's all part of their day job. So they're not like living in their parents' basement, just sort of putting out code, and that's what they're doing. I mean, they're creating and releasing software that actually makes their job easier at wherever they're working at. I mean, that's fraught because some people talk about paying a lot of these volunteers. But if you're working at a large tech company, it's kind of hard for you to take money when that's part of your jobs as a sign. I think the issue becomes is when you have a lot of these smaller projects, you have maybe one or two developers who are working on some project, and that's maybe 20% of their extra time, like they do at Google or things like that. Maybe it's not your primary job, it's maybe your tertiary. I think that's where the problems become, is because these things are not really meant to be fully production code without those people involved. So the whole notion that people are just volunteers, I don't think that that's actually true. And I mean, I've been poking around the data Number of contributors, Microsoft and Red Hat and Google, I think they all go
Sure.
back and forth on the number of contributor. But I think pure play volunteers, I think that it's probably Pareto rule. It's probably 20%. 80% of the people out there probably are being paid by an organization. They're just not being paid full time to run an open source software project because there's not really a business model inside of that. And so,
right.
I think that we had to understand. I think it's important for the open industry to understand like what the model is of that going forward, so then you can actually understand how do you meet the needs for things like security and getting security built in from the get-go. Not from the end, but yeah, that's just sort of my thing. I think that I don't think the data is really out there yet on that stuff.
Cool. Well, John, that was super insightful. And I want to put a bow on this by saying thank you again, everyone that's tuning in. John Scott, co-founder, COO, and head of national national cybersecurity sales at Ion Channel. Check them out. Thank you all for tuning in. John, thanks again, my friend.
Thanks so much. Love the shirt. See you later.
Thank you. Double-breasted.